sleeping stories.
Behind the armor, beneath the lies, one organization planned to murder every survivor in the wasteland.
The Enclave sips darkest secret. A legacy of blood and power. Behind the ruins of what America once promised to become, there exists a file that was never meant to surface. Deep within the corroded vaults of an organization that called itself the last hope of humanity, a truth so venomous festers that even those who authored it refuse to speak its name aloud. This is not a story of heroes rising from ashes. This is a confession written in blood, sealed with lies, and buried beneath layers of propaganda so thick that the world forgot to question what lay underneath. They called themselves the Enclave. To the scattered survivors of the wasteland, that name carried weight. It whispered of old-world authority, of government continuity, of a promise that somewhere in the chaos, order still persisted. But what the refugees and vault dwellers never understood was that the Enclave did not preserve civilization. They preserved something far older, far darker, something that had been rotting in the heart of pre-war America long before the bombs ever fell. In the year 2077, as nuclear fire erased the surface world, a select few vanished into fortified complexes that had been prepared decades in advance. These were not shelters built for the masses. These were sanctuaries reserved for those who held power, those who had seen the end coming and made certain they would survive to inherit what remained. But survival was never their only objective. Within those sealed chambers, away from the screaming chaos above, a different kind of experiment began. One that would redefine what it meant to be human. The terminals that remain operational in their abandoned outposts tell fragments of a story the Enclave tried to erase. Redacted communications, deleted medical logs, casualty reports filed under classification codes that no longer exist in any database. And in the margins of those documents, written in the hurried handwriting of scientists who knew what they were creating, a single phrase appears again and again. Protocol, Crimson Descent. No one outside the Enclave High Command knew what those words meant. The soldiers who carried out the orders were told it was for the restoration of America. The researchers who conducted the experiments believed they were engineering a superior future. But the subjects, the thousands of men, women, and children who were processed through the medical wings of Enclave facilities, learned the truth in their final moments. And by then, it was far too late to resist. Decades before their oil rig fortress would explode off the California coast, decades before their remnants would scatter across the eastern seaboard, the Enclave had already committed an atrocity so profound that it would make the nuclear holocaust look like mercy. This was not a war crime, born of desperation. This was calculated, methodical, and executed with the cold precision of those who believed themselves to be gods, shaping a new world from the bones of the old. The wasteland knows the Enclave as invaders in advanced power armor, as zealots who burn settlements that refused to kneel, as the remnants of a government that never cared for the people it claimed to protect. But the wasteland does not know the origin of that cruelty. It does not know what was done in those early years, when the Enclave still had time, resources, and an entire generation of locked-away citizens to experiment upon without consequence or witness. Tonight, we open the file that was never supposed to exist. Tonight, we speak the names of those who architected the unthinkable. And tonight, you will understand why the Enclave does not simply want to rebuild America. They want to erase everyone who is not them. Because buried in their bloodline is a secret they can never allow the wasteland to discover. A legacy, not of survival, but of something far worse. The Enclave did not begin with the bombs. Its roots stretched back to the cold paranoia of the 1960s, when men in unmarked offices realized that nuclear war was no longer a possibility, but an inevitability. While the public was sold the comforting fiction of civil defense and duck and cover drills, a different conversation was happening in the shadowed corridors of military intelligence. A conversation about who deserved to survive, and more importantly, who did not. Project Safe House was the official designation, a nationwide initiative to construct underground facilities capable of preserving government continuity in the event of total societal collapse. Vault Tech received the contracts. The military provided the logistics, and buried within the paperwork, hidden behind shell companies and black budget allocations, a secondary objective emerged. The facilities were not being built to save America. They were being built to reshape it. The architects of this vision understood something that the masses never grasped. Democracy had failed. The great experiment of governance by the people had produced weakness, inefficiency, and moral decay. What the nation required was not preservation but purification. A return to the hierarchies that had built empires, enforced through science rather than sentiment. The Enclave would not simply outlast the apocalypse. They would use it as a furnace to burn away everything impure and forge a new world from what remained. By 2077, their preparations were complete. 13 primary installations scattered across the continental United States. Each one a self-contained city buried beneath mountains and deserts. The Poseidon Energy oil rig off the coast, converted into a mobile command center capable of surviving any strike, and most critically, the personnel lists. Every family selected for inclusion had been vetted across 3 generations. Genetic profiles, political loyalty, absence of hereditary illness. They were not choosing survivors. They were breeding stock for a species they intended to engineer. When the sirens wailed on that October morning, the Enclave went dark. Blast doors sealed. Communication arrays went silent. To the outside world, the United States government had ceased to exist. But within those fortified chambers, power remained unbroken. President Richardson assumed his role, not as a leader of refugees, but as the architect of humanity's next chapter. And standing beside him, carrying folders thick with experimental protocols, were the men who would turn theory into terrible reality. Dr. Thomas Eckhart was not the first to propose genetic engineering as a solution to radiation exposure, but he was the first to suggest that exposure itself could be weaponized as a selection mechanism. His papers, circulated among the Enclave's scientific division, argued that the survivors on the surface were not victims to be saved, but failures to be eliminated. They had proven themselves genetically inferior by their very survival in the wasteland. They had adapted to poison, and in doing so had ceased to be human. The ideology took root quickly among the isolated inhabitants of the Enclave facilities. Cut off from the surface, surrounded by sterile walls and recycled air, they needed a narrative to justify their existence. They needed to believe that their survival was not random fortune but manifest destiny. The doctrine of genetic purity gave them that belief. It transformed their isolation into superiority, their fear into righteous purpose. General Constantine Chase provided the military framework. Under his command, the Enclave security forces were restructured from defenders into enforcers. Training protocols emphasized not combat readiness but ideological conditioning. Soldiers were taught that every wasteland survivor was a genetic contaminant, that mercy was weakness, that the mission to reclaim America required the stomach to do what previous generations had lacked the courage to attempt. He did not train warriors. He trained executioners who believed they were saviors. By 2080, the Enclave had established its internal hierarchy with brutal efficiency. The presidential line provided civilian authority. The science division provided the methods, the military wing provided the force, and beneath them all, a population of citizens who had been raised in bunkers, fed on propaganda, and taught from childhood that they were the last true humans on a planet of mutated abominations. They did not question the mission. They embraced it. The first surface expeditions began in 2085. Small reconnaissance teams and prototype power armor sent to assess the state of the wasteland and identify resources. What they found exceeded even the Enclave leadership's darkest expectations. The survivors had not perished. They had endured, adapted, and in some places begun to rebuild. Settlements formed from scavenged materials, trade routes established between ruins, a stubborn, irradiated humanity that refused to die. For the Enclave, this was not hope. This was an infestation. The surface world had become a breeding ground for genetic deviation, a contaminated landscape where the failed remnants of the old world clung to existence like radiation-scarred vermin. Every settlement discovered was catalogued not as a sign of human resilience, but as a target for future sterilization. Every survivor encountered was documented not as a fellow American, but as biological evidence of contamination. The reports sent back to Enclave Command were clinical in their assessment. The wasteland dwellers exhibited radiation resistance far beyond predicted models. Genetic analysis of captured subjects revealed mutations that had stabilized across generations. Some showed immunity to airborne toxins. Others demonstrated enhanced healing. The science division studied these adaptations with cold fascination, not to replicate them but to understand the enemy they would eventually need to destroy. Control Station Enclave, the oil rig fortress that served as the heart of their operation, became the nexus of planning for what they called the reclamation. Maps covered the walls of strategy rooms, marking every known settlement, every concentration of survivors, every pocket of resistance that would need to be eliminated. Timelines were drafted, resource allocations calculated, and in the laboratories deep within the rig, weapons were being prepared that would make the nuclear apocalypse look like a warning shot. This was not conquest in any traditional sense. The Enclave did not want slaves or subjects. They wanted empty land, cleansed soil, a blank continent upon which to rebuild their vision of America. And to achieve that vision, they would need to commit genocide on a scale that history had never witnessed. Not in rage, not in war, but in the calm, methodical certainty that they were performing surgery on a dying species. The Enclave understood that revelation would breed resistance. Their early operations on the surface were therefore designed not to announce their presence, but to test their capabilities. Small settlements on the fringes of civilization began experiencing what survivors documented as raids by unknown forces. Men in armor that gleamed like polished steel, weapons that fired coherent light instead of bullets. And always the same pattern: no negotiation, no demands. Just systematic extermination followed by complete sterilization of the site. Navarro became their primary staging ground on the mainland. Disguised as a refueling depot for pre-war vehicles, the base concealed an entire battalion of Enclave troops and the manufacturing facilities needed to produce their advanced weaponry. From this position in Northern California, they launched what internal documents referred to as purity sweeps. Operations designed to clear designated zones of all human presence while testing the effectiveness of their armaments against wasteland targets. The communities hit during these early campaigns had no framework to understand what was happening to them. They knew raiders, understood tribal warfare, had survived super mutant attacks and deathclaw migrations, but this was different. These attackers moved with military precision. They established perimeters, executed flanking maneuvers, and left nothing alive. Survivors who managed to escape described watching their homes burned with plasma fire hot enough to turn sand into glass. They spoke of soldiers who ignored pleas for mercy, who shot children with the same clinical efficiency they used to destroy livestock. Enclave Command documented each operation with meticulous detail. Kill counts, ammunition expenditure, effectiveness of various weapon systems against irradiated human physiology, time required for complete area sterilization. The reports read less like military assessments and more like quality control documentation for an industrial process, because that was precisely how the Enclave viewed the reclamation. Not as warfare, but as pest control on a continental scale. Colonel Augustus Autumn Sr. oversaw many of these operations personally. He walked through the smoking remains of settlements his troops had just erased, taking biological samples from corpses, measuring radiation levels in the ash, and calculating logistical requirements for scaling these methods to larger population centers. His journals, recovered decades later from an abandoned outpost, reveal a man who did not take pleasure in the killing, but viewed it as necessary hygiene. He compared it to scrubbing mold from a wall, burning infected tissue to save the healthy body beneath. The survivors who witnessed these attacks and lived to tell of them were dismissed as delusional by other wasteland communities. Their descriptions of advanced technology and coordinated military forces seemed impossible in a world where most people fought with pipe rifles and scavenged pre-war ammunition. The Enclave relied on this disbelief. It allowed them to operate in the spaces between settlements, to strike and vanish before any coordinated response could form. They were ghosts in powered armor, legends that kept people awake in the dark. But legends breed investigation. And, in 2198, a Brotherhood of Steel reconnaissance unit operating in the Northern Territories encountered something that would shatter the Enclave's veil of secrecy. They discovered a mass grave, not the scattered remains of a caravan ambush or the aftermath of a super mutant feeding ground. This was organized, hundreds of bodies arranged in rows, each one showing evidence of systematic execution. Plasma burns at the base of skulls, and scattered among the dead, shell casings stamped with manufacturing codes that predated the war by only a few years. The Brotherhood reported their findings through their communication network. Scribes analyzed the evidence. Paladins began asking questions in settlements across the wastes. And slowly, a pattern emerged. Dozens of communities had vanished over the past decade. Hundreds more reported encounters with heavily armed forces that matched no known faction. The pieces began connecting. Somewhere in the wasteland, a military organization with pre-war technology was conducting extermination operations. And they were doing it with the resources and discipline of a functional government. For the Enclave leadership, this exposure represented a critical juncture. Their plan had always required secrecy until they possessed the means to execute the reclamation in totality. Partial operations created evidence. Evidence created an investigation. An investigation would eventually lead to organized resistance. President Richardson convened an emergency session of the Enclave High Command to address what they termed the contamination of operational security. The debate that followed would fracture the organization in ways none of them anticipated. Dr. Charles Curling stood before the assembled leadership and presented what he called the final solution. A biological agent derived from the forced evolutionary virus, modified to target genetic markers present in all surface survivors, but absent in the Enclave population. It would spread through air and water, killing within 72 hours of exposure, and leave the environment otherwise intact. He estimated global deployment would eliminate 98% of wasteland humans within 6 months. It was efficient, it was comprehensive, and it was ready for production. The proposal divided the command structure immediately. The military wing, led by General Sebastian Gannon, endorsed immediate deployment. He argued that exposure had accelerated the timeline, Every day they waited gave the surface population more time to organize, to prepare, to potentially threaten enclave installations. The weapon existed. The moral justification had been established years ago. Hesitation now was not caution, but cowardice. But others saw the flaw in this logic. Colonel Daniel Hartman rose from his seat and asked the question that would haunt the enclave for the next 2 decades. What happens when we release a virus we cannot control? What happens if it mutates? What happens if our genetic screening was imperfect and enclave personnel begin dying alongside the targets? The FEV had already proven unpredictable in previous experiments. Weaponizing it for global deployment was not strategy. It was desperation dressed as strength. The debate raged for 3 days. Scientists presented models. Military commanders outlined deployment scenarios. Ethicists, the few who remained in the enclave structure, argued that even by their own doctrine, this crossed a line from purification into genocide. But their voices carried little weight among men who had spent decades convincing themselves that mass extermination was necessary medicine for a sick world. President Richardson cast the deciding vote. The modified FEV, designated Curling 13, would be produced and stockpiled but not deployed. Not yet. The enclave would continue conventional operations while perfecting the delivery systems for the bioweapon. They would build orbital platforms capable of global dispersal. They would establish redundant production facilities. And most critically, they would develop countermeasures to ensure no possibility of the virus affecting enclave personnel. When they struck, it would be total. No exposure, no warning, no survivors. But the decision satisfied no one. The military wing viewed it as weakness. The scientific division saw it as wasted time. And among the lower ranks, soldiers who had spent years executing wasteland, survivors began asking why they were delaying the inevitable. Doubt crept into the sterile corridors of enclave facilities. Not doubt about the mission, but doubt about the leadership's commitment to seeing it through. The ideological certainty that had unified them began showing hairline fractures. Colonel Hartman disappeared 3 weeks after the vote. His quarters were found empty. His personal files deleted, his power armor missing from the armory. Search teams combed Navarro and found no trace. Some assumed defection. Others whispered assassination by hardliners who viewed his opposition as treason. President Richardson ordered the incident classified and moved forward as though nothing had happened. But everyone knew the enclave was no longer unified in purpose. The fractures spread quickly once they began. Regional commanders started interpreting orders through their own ideological lens. Some intensified their surface operations, burning settlements with renewed aggression as though trying to compensate for the delayed bioweapon deployment. Others pulled back, questioning whether the reclamation remained achievable or if they were simply prolonging a war they no longer had the resources to win. Communication between facilities became sporadic, strained, coated with mistrust. At Control Station Enclave, President Richardson watched his carefully constructed hierarchy decompose. Supply lines from mainland facilities grew unreliable. Reports arrived weeks late, or not at all. Requests for reinforcements went unanswered. The oil rig, once the beating heart of enclave authority, was becoming isolated. And in that isolation, Richardson made the decision that would define the enclave's final years. He authorized full production of Curling 13 without the safety measures, without the countermeasures, without the planetary deployment systems. He would take the weapon they had and use it regionally, proving its effectiveness, forcing his fractured command to witness the power they possessed. The order went out in October 2241. Begin field trials of the modified FEV on selected wasteland populations. Monitor dispersal patterns. document mortality rates. Prepare for expanded deployment. It was meant to reunify the Enclave through demonstration of their ultimate weapon. Instead, it set in motion the chain of events that would bring their entire structure crashing down. The testing sites were chosen with deliberate calculation. Small tribal villages far from major trade routes, isolated vault communities that had minimal contact with neighboring settlements, places where entire populations could vanish without triggering widespread investigation. The Enclave referred to these locations by numerical designations rather than names, Site 7 through Site 23. Each one a laboratory where Curling 13 would demonstrate what years of debate had only theorized. Site 7 was a farming collective, built around a functioning water purifier, home to approximately 200 men, women, and children, who had spent 3 generations turning irradiated soil into something resembling arable land. The Enclave deployment team arrived at dawn, established a perimeter, and released the modified virus through aerosol dispersal units positioned upwind of the settlement. Then they waited. Observers in sealed environmental suits documented what happened next with clinical detachment that would haunt the few who later read their reports. The virus worked faster than Dr. Curling had predicted. Within 6 hours, the first subjects began exhibiting symptoms: respiratory distress, hemorrhaging from mucous membranes, convulsions as their genetic structure unraveled at the cellular level. By hour 12, 70% of the population was incapacitated. By hour 24, the settlement had gone silent. The Enclave team entered wearing biohazard containment and found exactly what they had engineered: 200 corpses, their bodies displaying the characteristic breakdown that marked successful FEV modification. The virus had killed everything human and left the infrastructure untouched. Field trials continued across 17 additional sites over the next 8 months. Each test refined their understanding of dispersal patterns, environmental persistence, and mutation rates. The data confirmed what the Enclave High Command needed to hear. Curling 13 was viable for continental deployment. Production facilities on the oil rig ramped up to full capacity. Aerosol distribution systems were integrated into vertibird craft for aerial release. And President Richardson prepared the announcement that would commit the Enclave to irreversible action. But Site 19 broke the pattern. It was supposed to be another clean test, another data point confirming the weapon's reliability. Instead, it became the spark that ignited everything the Enclave had tried to prevent. The settlement chosen for exposure sat adjacent to a caravan route used by New California Republic traders. When the population died, the caravans found them, and among those traders was a former vault dweller who recognized biological warfare when he saw it because he had survived it once before. Word reached Arroyo within a week. The tribal elders convened and heard testimony about an entire village dead from no visible cause, their bodies showing signs consistent with FEV exposure. They knew that signature. They had lost people to the Master's armies decades ago. This was not natural plague. This was weaponized extinction. And when they asked who possessed the technology and motivation to deploy such horror, the answer came from an unexpected source. A wandering trader who had once been an Enclave deserter, who had walked away from Navarro years ago because he could not stomach what his commanders were planning. The deserter's testimony provided what the wasteland had never possessed: concrete intelligence about Enclave facilities, command structure, technological capabilities, and most critically, their location. Control Station Enclave sat off the California coast, accessible only by vertibird or a single working oil tanker docked at a hidden pier. It was the head of the serpent, and if someone could reach it, if someone could penetrate the fortress and sabotage their production capabilities, the Enclave's bioweapon program could be crippled before continental deployment began. The tribal elders understood they lacked the resources for such a mission, but they knew who might. The Brotherhood of Steel had been investigating Enclave activities for years. The new California Republic had the manpower and motivation to act, and there were individuals in the wasteland, rare ones, who had proven capable of impossible tasks when everything depended on it. Arroyo sent runners to every Allied settlement, every faction that had reason to fear the Enclave's vision of a purified America. The message was simple: move now or watch everyone you know dissolve from the inside out. The response came faster than anyone anticipated. Not from governments or armies, but from the places where survival had bred the kind of stubborn defiance that refused to die quietly. Tribal warriors who had spent their lives fighting for every scrap of land, vault dwellers who remembered what it meant to be hunted, ghouls who knew exactly what genetic purity rhetoric meant for their continued existence, super mutants who understood they would be first on the extermination list, and Brotherhood paladins who finally had a target worthy of their accumulated firepower. They did not have time to build a formal coalition. The intelligence suggested Curling 13 production was nearing completion. Deployment could begin within months, maybe weeks. What formed instead was something the wasteland had never produced before. A unified front born not from politics or ideology, but from the primal recognition that extinction erases all other disagreements. Caravans began moving weapons and supplies toward the coast. Technical specialists shared whatever intelligence they possessed about Enclave security protocols. And at the center of it all, a single individual emerged who would carry the burden of infiltration. They called him the Chosen One, though he had been given that title for different reasons years before. He was not a soldier, not a trained operative, just someone who had walked from Arroyo into the wasteland looking for a salvation device to save his dying village, and in the process had toppled governments, destroyed armies, and learned that sometimes saving people required becoming the weapon they needed. When the tribal elders explained what needed to be done, he did not hesitate. He had already lost too many people to genetic supremacy. He would not lose the rest of the world to it. The plan was direct because complexity invited failure. Acquire Enclave power armor from a fallen soldier or defector. Use it to board the oil tanker that serviced Control Station Enclave. Infiltrate the rig. Locate the FEV production labs. Sabotage the virus stockpiles. And if possible, destroy the entire research division. Then escaped before the Enclave realized what had happened. It was a mission that depended on luck, timing, and the hope that even inside the fortress there might be personnel who had begun questioning what they were creating. Preparation took 6 weeks. The Brotherhood provided technical training on Enclave systems. A captured suit of advanced power armor was modified to conceal its stolen status. Weapons were selected for close quarters combat in confined spaces. And most critically, intelligence operatives mapped the interior layout of Control Station Enclave from testimony provided by 3 separate defectors who had fled the organization at different points over the past decade. The maps did not align perfectly. Renovations had changed corridors. Security had been upgraded, but it was enough to navigate by. The oil tanker departed from the hidden pier on a morning that felt like every other morning on the California coast. Enclave personnel moved with routine efficiency, loading supplies, conducting equipment checks, running through departure protocols that had been standard procedure for decades. None of them noticed that one of the soldiers boarding wore armor that had been reported lost in a surface engagement 3 months prior. None of them questioned why a transfer requisition had appeared in their personnel logs overnight. By the time the tanker reached the oil rig, the Chosen One was already inside their perimeter. Control Station Enclave rose from the Pacific, like a monument to pre-war hubris. A maze of drilling platforms and habitation modules connected by catwalks and sealed corridors. Vertibirds circled overhead in perpetual patrol. Automated turrets tracked movement across every approach vector. And inside, 300 Enclave personnel went about their duties with the certainty that their fortress remained impregnable. They had survived the nuclear holocaust. They had built weapons that could reshape the genetic landscape of Earth. What could possibly threaten them now? The Chosen One moved through the facility with practiced patience, studying patrol patterns, memorizing security checkpoints, blending into the routine movements of soldiers who never expected infiltration. He passed laboratories where scientists monitored viral cultures in containment fields. He walked through barracks where troops debated deployment strategies for the coming reclamation. He stood in corridors where propaganda posters proclaimed the genetic destiny of pure humanity. And with every step deeper into the rig, he understood that these people truly believed they were saving the world. Finding the FEV production labs required 2 days of careful reconnaissance. They were located in the lowest levels of the primary platform, behind biometric security that cycled every 6 hours. The Chosen One waited for a shift change, followed a research team through the checkpoint, and found himself standing in the facility where Curling 13 existed in quantities sufficient to sterilize the continent. Rows of containment cylinders, aerosol compression systems, distribution manifolds connected to delivery mechanisms that could be loaded onto vertibirds within hours. It was everything the wasteland feared, concentrated in a single temperature-controlled room. Sabotage would trigger immediate lockdown. Alarms would seal every exit. Enclave troops would flood the corridors before he could reach the surface. But there was another option. One suggested by a Brotherhood scribe who understood Enclave psychology better than the Enclave understood themselves. These people feared contamination above everything else. They had built their entire ideology around genetic purity and separation from wasteland mutation. What would happen if someone released the virus inside their own fortress? If the air they breathed became the weapon they had created, would they sacrifice themselves to contain it? Or would they panic like any other humans facing extinction? The Chosen One made his decision in the span of 3 heartbeats. He disabled the primary containment field, triggered emergency venting protocols that would route atmospheric controls through the FEV storage chambers, and activated the base-wide intercom to deliver a message that would burn through decades of Enclave certainty. Your virus is airborne in the facility. Your pure genetics are now exposed to the weapon you built for others. You have 72 hours. Spend them however you choose. Chaos erupted instantly. Alarms screamed through every corridor. Scientists scrambled to verify containment status and discovered what their instruments confirmed. Curling, 13 concentrations spiking in ventilation systems. Trace particles registering in habitation modules. The virus spreads through the recycled air of a sealed facility, with nowhere for it to go. Enclave personnel froze in their tracks, touching their faces, checking for symptoms, understanding with crystalline horror that they had become the test subjects. President Richardson appeared on internal monitors within minutes, his face composed, but his eyes betraying the calculation happening behind them. He declared the contamination a technical malfunction, ordered all personnel to report to medical for prophylactic treatment, assured them that countermeasures existed and would be distributed immediately. But his words rang hollow in corridors where people were already checking each other for the first signs of hemorrhaging. The Enclave had spent years perfecting a virus to kill everyone, not them. They had never bothered developing a cure. The medical teams mobilized with desperate efficiency, but their instruments could only confirm what everyone already knew. The virus was loose. Air samples taken from every deck showed concentrations consistent with active dispersal. Personnel began exhibiting respiratory symptoms within the first 12 hours, exactly matching the timeline documented in field trials. The doctors who had authored those reports now found themselves reading their own death sentences written in clinical language they had perfected on others. Some Enclave soldiers attempted to seal themselves in powered armor, believing the environmental systems would filter out the contamination. They discovered too late that Curling-13 had been engineered to persist in microscopic particulate form, specifically to defeat such measures. Others barricaded themselves in quarters with emergency oxygen supplies, buying hours instead of days. And a few, the ones who understood exactly what they had created and what it would do, simply sat down and waited for the dissolution to begin. President Richardson retreated to the command center with his senior staff and made the call that defined his final hours. He contacted Navarro and ordered immediate evacuation of all mainland facilities. The oil rig was lost. Control Station Enclave would become a tomb for everyone aboard, but the organization itself would survive through its dispersed elements. The mission would continue under new leadership. America would still be reclaimed, even if the architects of that reclamation would not live to see it completed. The response from Navarro shattered what remained of Richardson's authority. Colonel Augustus Autumn Jr., who had assumed command after his father's death in a surface operation, refused the evacuation order. He demanded to know what had happened, how the most secure facility in the Enclave arsenal had been compromised, why the president was issuing retreat commands instead of mobilizing a response. And when Richardson explained that the FEV had been released internally, that everyone on the rig was already dead, Autumn's reply came through the static with cold finality. Then you have proven the weapon works on our genetics as effectively as theirs. Your great purification includes us. The transmission ended. Navarro went silent, and Richardson understood that the fractures he had tried to contain had finally split the Enclave completely. The mainland forces would not continue his mission. They would abandon the reclamation, scatter into the wasteland, become another failed remnant of pre-war ambition. Everything he had built, every sacrifice he had justified, would end not with the rebirth of America, but with his own organization cannibalizing itself in the chaos. The chosen one moved through the dying facility like a ghost among the condemned. Enclave personnel stumbled past him in corridors, too focused on their own deteriorating physiology to notice an infiltrator. Some begged for help that did not exist. Others sat against walls composing final messages to loved ones in distant facilities who would never receive them. And in the laboratories, scientists worked frantically to synthesize a counteragent from compounds that had never been tested because the Enclave had never imagined needing to cure themselves. He found what he needed in the command center archives. Every test site, every field trial, every settlement the Enclave had marked for future extermination. The complete intelligence profile of their reclamation strategy, documented with the thoroughness of men who never expected their files to be read by anyone outside the organization. He copied everything to a holotape that would fit in a concealed armor compartment, proof that would justify what happened here, evidence that would prevent history from remembering the Enclave as martyrs instead of architects of genocide. The oil rig began its final descent into chaos as the virus reached its 48-hour threshold. Bodies filled the corridors, where people had collapsed while attempting to reach medical stations. The smell of biological breakdown saturated ventilation systems that still tried futilely to scrub contaminated air. And in the reactor levels, where technicians had stopped monitoring critical systems, warning klaxons blared as containment fields degraded and coolant pressure spiked toward catastrophic failure. Richardson's final broadcast went out on all Enclave frequencies, picked up by facilities across the wasteland that had once answered to Control Station Authority. His voice carried the weight of a man watching his ideology die along with his body. He spoke of sacrifice, of the necessity of their mission, of how future generations would understand that everything done had been required to preserve humanity from extinction. But beneath the rhetoric, there was something else. Not quite remorse, but perhaps the first recognition that purity built on mass murder was not salvation but damnation dressed in patriotic language. The Chosen One left the command center and made for the vertibird hangar, the only exit route that did not require swimming through radioactive Pacific waters. He found the bay in controlled chaos as the few pilots still functional attempted to evacuate senior personnel who believed their rank might somehow exempt them from viral infection. One craft was already lifting off, overloaded with scientists and their research materials. Another sat idle while its pilot convulsed in the cockpit, blood streaming from his nose. And at the far end of the platform, a lone vertibird sat fueled and ready with no one left alive to claim it. The launch was not graceful. Alarms shrieked as unauthorized takeoff protocols triggered automated defensive systems. Turrets tracked the stolen craft as it rose from the platform, firing bursts that sparked off the fuselage, but failed to bring it down. The Chosen One pushed the engines to maximum thrust and angled toward the mainland, watching in the rear displays as Control Station Enclave grew smaller behind him. The facility that had represented the pinnacle of Enclave power, the fortress that was supposed to be the launching point for continental purification, now a floating graveyard where genetic supremacy had consumed its own architects. Behind him, the oil rig's reactor finally breached containment. The explosion lit the Pacific horizon like a second sunrise, a column of fire and steam that could be seen from the California coast. The shockwaves scattered debris across miles of ocean, and when the flames subsided, nothing remained of Control Station Enclave except burning wreckage sinking into dark water. 300 Enclave personnel, decades of research, the entire stockpile of curling 13. All of it erased in a moment that felt like cosmic correction for sins that had been building since long before the bombs fell. News of the destruction spread through wasteland, settlements within days. Caravans carried the story. Radio operators broadcast unconfirmed reports. And eventually, when the Chosen One returned to Arroyo and presented the recovered intelligence files, the full scope of what the Enclave had planned became known to those who had narrowly escaped it. The reaction was not celebration, but something closer to exhausted relief. They had been hours away from extinction, hours away from watching their families die from an enemy they could not see or fight or even understand until too late. But the mainland Enclave had not died with their command center. Navarro still functioned. Regional outposts remained operational, and scattered across the wasteland were soldiers and scientists who had devoted their entire lives to the ideology of genetic reclamation. Some would abandon the mission, integrate into surface communities, try to forget what they had been part of. Others would double down, convinced that Richardson's failure proved only that the reclamation required harder men willing to finish what he could not. Colonel Autumn became the voice of this remnant faction. He relocated what remained of Enclave command to the capital wasteland, to a facility buried beneath the ruins of Washington, D.C. that had survived the nuclear exchange intact. There, surrounded by the monuments of the government they claimed to represent, he began rebuilding Enclave forces with a modified doctrine. They would still pursue genetic purity. They would still view wastelanders as contaminated stock, but they would do it gradually, through control of resources rather than bioweapons, through dominance of water supplies and food production, through forcing surface survivors to submit or die slowly rather than all at once. This new Enclave was smaller, more cautious, stripped of the infrastructure that had made continental extermination seem achievable. but it retained the core conviction that had driven Richardson and his predecessors, that America belonged to the genetically pure, that everyone else was an obstacle to be removed, and that eventually, through patience and ruthless application of superior technology, they would still inherit the wasteland after its current inhabitants had been systematically eliminated through starvation, dehydration, and controlled attrition. The Brotherhood of Steel recognized the threat immediately. Elder Owen Lyons deployed forces to contain Enclave expansion in the capital region. Skirmishes erupted in the ruins as both factions fought for control of pre-war facilities and resource nodes. The Enclave found themselves no longer the dominant military power, but one faction among many, forced to compete for territory with groups that possessed their own advanced technology and combat experience. The age of Enclave supremacy had ended. What remained was a guerrilla force clinging to ideology that reality had already disproven. Years passed. The Enclave continued operating in diminished capacity, recruiting from the few who still believed in genetic hierarchy, scavenging pre-war technology to maintain their aging equipment, launching occasional raids against settlements that strayed too close to their holdouts. But with each engagement, their numbers dwindled. Attrition ground them down. Defections increased as younger members questioned whether dying for Richardson's vision made sense when that vision had already failed catastrophically. By 2277, the Enclave existed as a shadow of its former structure. Autumn commanded perhaps 200 combat-effective soldiers, supported by a handful of scientists maintaining equipment that could no longer be replaced. They occupied the remains of Raven Rock, a bunker complex that offered security but trapped them in a defensive posture. They possessed one remaining advantage, a massive orbital weapons platform called Bradley Hercules that had survived the war and could still obliterate surface targets. But activation required codes that had been lost with Control Station Enclave, making it a monument to power they could see but not wield. The final collapse came not from external assault, but internal contradiction. Autumn had maintained ideological purity by refusing to recruit from surface populations, insisting that genetic contamination disqualified wastelanders from service. But his forces needed replacements, needed technical specialists, needed the resources that only integration with surface communities could provide. When he finally authorized limited recruitment of wastelanders for support roles, he crossed the line that had defined Enclave identity since its founding. The moment genetic purity became negotiable, the Enclave ceased to exist as anything more than another militant faction wearing pre-war uniforms. The end came in 2278. When the Lone Wanderer, a vault dweller who had become entangled in the conflict over Project Purity, infiltrated Raven Rock and destroyed the facility from within. Autumn died attempting to defend technology. He could no longer operate. His soldiers scattered into the wasteland, some trying to reach distant outposts, others surrendering to Brotherhood forces, and a few simply vanishing into the ruins to live whatever life remained to them as individuals rather than components of a failed ideology. The Enclave had existed for over 200 years. From its origins in Cold War paranoia through its transformation into architects of genetic genocide, it had represented the worst impulses of pre-war America, given structure and purpose. It had survived the nuclear holocaust, only to be destroyed by the very weapon it created to eliminate others. And in its final years, it has become proof that ideology divorced from reality eventually consumes those who refuse to abandon it. The wasteland continued without them. Settlements rebuilt. Trade networks expanded. The new California Republic pushed eastward, bringing law and taxation and all the messy compromises of actual governance. The Brotherhood herded technology and debated whether humanity deserved saving, and scattered across the ruins. In places where Enclave forces had committed atrocities, survivors told their children stories about the soldiers in shining armor who had believed themselves gods and learned too late that gods bleed the same as anyone else. The records left behind painted a portrait of systematic horror that the wasteland struggled to process. When Brotherhood scribes compiled the intelligence recovered from Control Station Enclave, they discovered documentation spanning decades, detailed logs of field trials, genetic profiles of surface populations marked for elimination, budget allocations for weapons programs designed to sterilize continents, and most damning correspondence between Enclave leadership that revealed they had known exactly what they were doing. This was not madness or desperation. It was calculated extermination, pursued with bureaucratic efficiency. The settlements that had been test sites for Curling 13 became pilgrimage destinations for those trying to understand what had nearly happened to everyone. Mass graves were excavated and analyzed. Soil samples confirmed viral persistence in the environment years after dispersal, and in the ruins of homes where entire families had died together, investigators found the mundane evidence of interrupted lives. Meals left unfinished on tables, children's toys scattered in yards, letters written but never sent. The Enclave had not seen people when they chose these locations. They had seen numbers on spreadsheets, statistical validations of weapons performance. Communities across the wasteland demanded accountability, but found no one left to hold responsible. The architects were dead. The soldiers had scattered. The facilities lay in ruins or had been seized by other factions. Justice required defendants, and all that remained were ghosts and testimony from defectors who claimed they had only followed orders, that they had believed the propaganda about genetic contamination, that they never truly understood what the reclamation would mean until it was too late to walk away. The new California Republic established tribunals to prosecute captured Enclave personnel. The trials became theaters of ideology clashing with reality. Defendants in prison jumpsuits who still insisted they had been trying to save humanity from itself. Prosecutors presenting evidence of children executed in their beds, communities burned for the crime of surviving radiation, and judges struggling to apply pre-war legal frameworks to crimes that exceeded anything those frameworks had imagined possible. Some were executed. More were imprisoned in facilities built from repurposed vaults where they would spend decades behind bars maintained by the same surface survivors they had tried to eliminate. And a few, the ones who provided intelligence about remaining Enclave holdouts or weapons caches, received reduced sentences and eventual integration into wasteland society under new identities. They moved through settlements as anonymous citizens, carrying secrets that would die with them, hoping no one would ever connect their faces to the uniforms they had once worn. The psychological impact proved harder to measure, but impossible to ignore. Entire generations grew up knowing they had been marked for extermination by people who looked human, spoke with authority, and believed themselves righteous. Parents explained to children that the shining armor had concealed hatred so pure it made raiders look like petty criminals, that education and technology did not prevent evil but could magnify it beyond anything ignorance could achieve, that the greatest threats came not from obvious monsters, but from those who built systems to make murder feel like civic duty. The Enclave defectors who tried to rebuild lives outside the organization faced communities that could not forget what that organization had represented. Some changed their names and moved to distant territories where their history remained unknown. Others formed isolated enclaves of their own, communities of former members trying to atone by dedicating their technical knowledge to helping the settlements they had once targeted. and a handful took their own lives, unable to reconcile what they had been part of with any vision of themselves as decent people deserving of continued existence. The technology left behind became both resource and curse. Vertibirds that could revolutionize trade and communication, but reminded everyone of the aerial attacks that had burned villages. Power armor that offered unmatched protection, but carried the iconography of genetic supremacy. Weapons that represented peak pre-war engineering, but had been designed specifically to kill wastelanders with maximum efficiency. The Brotherhood seized most of it, added it to their hordes, and debated endlessly whether using Enclave equipment dishonored those who had died to it. Medical research, recovered from Enclave facilities, provided breakthroughs in radiation treatment and genetic therapies that saved thousands of lives over subsequent decades. The irony was not lost on Wasteland. Doctors who used techniques developed to identify genetic contamination to instead cure it. Science that had been weaponized for elimination got repurposed for healing. The tools remained neutral. Only the hands that held them and the intentions that guided them determined whether they built or destroyed. Some settlements dismantled, Enclave installations entirely, erasing every trace that the organization had existed. They melted down the steel, scattered the components, and built new structures on the foundations as though covering graves with gardens. Others preserved the sites as museums and memorials, places where future generations could witness what happened when ideology valued purity over compassion. These locations drew visitors who walked through empty barracks and abandoned laboratories trying to understand how ordinary people convinced themselves that mass murder constituted patriotic service. The Brotherhood split over how to remember the Enclave. Elder Lions argued they represented everything the Brotherhood was founded to prevent: technology in the hands of those who lacked wisdom to wield it responsibly. His scribes documented every Enclave atrocity in exhaustive detail, creating archives that would ensure history recorded them accurately. But other Brotherhood chapters, particularly in the Western Territories, saw the Enclave differently. They viewed them as cautionary examples of what happened when military organizations prioritized ideology over pragmatism, but also recognized they had been effective at preserving pre-war knowledge, even if they applied it toward monstrous ends. The new California Republic absorbed former Enclave territory and personnel into its expanding structure. Politicians debated whether integration or exclusion better served their interests. Some argued that technical specialists who had served the Enclave possessed skills the Republic desperately needed for reconstruction. Others insisted that allowing them positions of influence risked importing the ideology that had driven the organization. The compromise satisfied no one but became policy anyway. Former Enclave members could serve in civilian technical roles, but were permanently barred from military or governmental positions requiring security clearance. Tribal communities that had been targeted in early Enclave operations held ceremonies for the dead that lasted weeks. They sang names into the night air, burned offerings to ancestors who had been denied proper burial, and taught their children stories about the metal demons who came from the ocean, bringing death that could not be fought with spears or courage. These oral histories became part of tribal identity, warnings passed down that survival required vigilance against those who claimed authority based on genetic inheritance or technological superiority. The ghouls, who had endured discrimination long before the Enclave codified it into operational doctrine, responded to the organization's collapse with grim satisfaction, but little celebration. They had always known what smooth-skinned humans thought of them. The Enclave had simply been honest about impulses that others concealed behind politeness. When Enclave facilities were opened, and evidence emerged of experiments conducted on captured ghouls, testing how the modified FEV affected their already mutated physiology. It confirmed what they had always suspected. They had never been seen as people. They had been seen as problems requiring solutions. Supermutants processed the Enclave's defeat through their own fractured perspectives. The intelligent ones recognized they had dodged extermination by the narrowest margin. Marcus, who led a community of mutants and humans in peaceful coexistence, used the Enclave as an example in his arguments that prejudice always led to violence when given institutional support. But other supermutants, the ones still influenced by the Master's ideology, or simply enjoying their strength, saw the Enclave's failure as proof that talking about genetic superiority meant nothing if you could not back it up with force. Decades passed, and the Enclave faded from immediate threat to historical nightmare. Children born after the oil rig explosion knew them only through stories their parents told. The distinctive Enclave iconography, the stylized E on armor plates and banners, became a symbol that invoked complicated reactions. To some it represented everything worth opposing. To others it served as reminder that evil rarely announced itself as such, but dressed itself in patriotic language and scientific authority. And to a few, scattered individuals nursing resentment about wasteland chaos and longing for pre-war order, it remained a promise that someone had tried to restore civilization even if they failed. Small groups, calling themselves Enclave remnants, continued operating in remote locations, claiming legitimacy through possession of equipment or knowledge passed down from the original organization. Most were frauds, raiders who adopted the branding because it intimidated settlers. A few were genuine survivors, aging soldiers maintaining rituals and protocols for an organization that no longer existed beyond their bunkers. The Brotherhood hunted them when discovered. The NCR prosecuted them when captured. And the Wasteland generally ignored them as long as they remained isolated and ineffective. The cost of revelation extended beyond those directly affected. It changed how the Wasteland viewed authority itself. Before the Enclave, people had assumed that organized government with advanced technology would naturally be beneficial. That structure and hierarchy meant civilization returning. The Enclave proved that organization could be turned toward monstrous ends with frightening efficiency. That the trappings of legitimate authority, uniforms and ranks and official protocols could conceal genocide. That trusting institutions based on their appearance rather than their actions invited catastrophe. This lesson reshaped political development across post-war America. The NCR became paranoid about military independence, implementing civilian oversight that frustrated field commanders but prevented any single branch from operating without accountability. The Brotherhood became more isolationist, convinced that only their order possessed the moral framework to handle advanced technology responsibly. And independent settlements formed defensive coalitions based not on shared governance, but mutual agreement to resist any faction that claimed genetic or technological superiority as justification for dominance. The modified FEV that had killed the Enclave remained a source of deep anxiety for wasteland scientists. The virus existed now. Someone had successfully weaponized it against specific genetic markers, and while the Enclave's stockpiles had been destroyed, the research underlying Curling 13 had been documented thoroughly enough that anyone with sufficient knowledge and resources could potentially recreate it. Facilities that had worked with FEV before the war were placed under permanent Brotherhood guard. Any research into genetic modification faced intense scrutiny. The Wasteland had learned that some knowledge, once weaponized, could never be fully contained. The environmental impact of Enclave operations took decades to fully understand. The test sites where Curling 13 had been deployed remained contaminated long after the bodies had been cleared. Plants that grew there exhibited strange mutations, distinct from standard radiation effects. Animals that drank from water sources near former release points died from organ failure matching viral symptoms. The Enclave had created a weapon that persisted in the ecosystem, invisible but deadly, waiting in soil and water for any human to encounter it. Cleanup efforts required resources and expertise that few wasteland communities possessed. The Brotherhood eventually deployed teams in environmental suits to neutralize the worst contamination zones, using chemical agents and controlled burns to break down viral particles that had bonded with organic matter. But some areas remained too dangerous for remediation. They were marked with warning symbols and left as exclusion zones where nothing human could safely travel. These dead lands became monuments to what the Enclave had been willing to unleash globally, preserved only by accident and infiltration rather than wisdom or restraint. The final cost could not be calculated in lives lost or territory scarred, but in trust destroyed. The Enclave had claimed to represent the legitimate continuation of American government. They had worn the uniforms, spoken the language, displayed the symbols of pre-war authority, and they had used that claim to justify attempting extinction of everyone who fell outside their genetic criteria. Every subsequent faction that tried to establish organized government faced suspicion rooted in that betrayal. Every soldier in pre-war styled armor triggered fear memories that took generations to fade. The Enclave had not just failed in their mission, they had poisoned the very concept of institutional authority for everyone who survived them. The wasteland moved forward because it had no choice. Settlements rebuilt, trade resumed. Children were born who would never know the terror of Enclave raids or the nearness of global extermination. But the scars remained visible for those who knew where to look. In the overgrown ruins of test sites, in the nightmares of survivors who had watched their families die from invisible contagion, in the hardened attitudes of communities that trusted no authority claiming to act for their own good. The Enclave had tried to purify humanity and instead contaminated the future with the memory of their attempt. Yet even in that darkness, something resembling hope emerged. The wasteland had faced organized genocide and survived, not through superior technology or military might, but through the stubborn refusal of scattered communities to die quietly. They had shared intelligence across factional lines, coordinated responses despite lacking formal alliances, and ultimately stopped the Enclave not because they were stronger, but because they were willing to risk everything to prevent the alternative. That lesson persisted even as the details faded. That survival sometimes required people to look past their differences and recognize common cause against threats that targeted everyone. The Chosen One, who had infiltrated Control Station Enclave and released the virus that destroyed it, lived the rest of his life watching communities process what had almost happened to them. He never sought recognition for what he had done, never spoke publicly about the choice to weaponize Curling 13 against its creators. But sometimes, in tribal councils or around caravan fires, people would ask him if the cost had been worth it. If killing 300 people to save millions constituted justice or just different math, and he would answer that he did not know, that moral clarity was a luxury for those who did not have to make decisions in sealed laboratories with the future burning down around them, that he lived with what he had done, and they lived because he had done it, and perhaps that was the only answer that mattered. The wasteland had been given another chance. Not because it deserved one, but because someone had been willing to become a weapon when weapons were what circumstances demanded. The Enclave had believed genetic purity would save humanity. Instead, humanity was saved by the very diversity the Enclave tried to eliminate. By tribal warriors and vault dwellers, ghouls and super mutants, Brotherhood soldiers and NCR citizens working together despite everything that divided them. The irony would have devastated Richardson if he had lived long enough to appreciate it. Purity was a weakness. Contamination was a strength, and the future belonged to everyone the Enclave had deemed unworthy of existence. The years turned into decades, and the wasteland developed a peculiar relationship with the memory of what the Enclave had been. It became the standard against which other threats were measured. When raiders grew too organized, people whispered they were becoming another Enclave. When the Brotherhood grew too isolated in their technology hoarding, critics warned they were walking the same path. The name itself transformed from an organization into a concept, shorthand for what happened when people convinced themselves their survival justified everyone else's extinction. Historians, the few who existed in settlements with resources to support such luxuries, debated endlessly about what the Enclave represented. Some argued they were an aberration, a unique combination of circumstances that could never repeat. Pre-war, paranoia, plus isolation, plus access to weapons of mass destruction. Others insisted they were simply the most honest expression of impulses that existed in every human society. The desire to define some people as worthy, and others as disposable. The Enclave had just possessed the means to act on beliefs that others only whispered. The truth likely lived somewhere between those positions, though truth was often less satisfying than the stories people told themselves. The Enclave had been built on real fears about survival in a post-nuclear world. They had genuinely believed radiation exposure was destroying human viability. They had looked at the mutations spreading through wasteland populations and seen extinction approaching. Where they failed was in their response. Instead of adaptation, they chose elimination. Instead of accepting that humanity would change, they decided to murder everyone who already had. This distinction mattered to those trying to extract lessons applicable to their own struggles. Every community in the wasteland faced questions about who belonged and who threatened them, about whether accepting outsiders meant cultural suicide or necessary evolution, about how to maintain identity while remaining open to change. The Enclave had answered those questions with genetic testing and firing squads. The wasteland tried to find better answers, but the effort remained ongoing, complicated, never fully resolved. Some former Enclave personnel who had integrated into wasteland society eventually came forward with their histories, not seeking forgiveness, but offering testimony about how ordinary people committed extraordinary atrocities. They described the indoctrination that began in childhood, the constant reinforcement that surface survivors were not truly human, the incremental steps that normalized first discrimination, then violence, then genocide. They explained how each escalation felt reasonable when viewed from inside the ideology, how every atrocity became justified as necessary for the greater mission. These confessions served as warnings about how easily moral boundaries eroded when institutions provided justification and authority figures demanded obedience. Young people in NCR schools read transcripts of these testimonies alongside histories of the Master's Army and the Brotherhood's technology hoarding. They learned that threats to wasteland survival came not just from external enemies, but from internal certainties. That the moment any group became convinced of their absolute righteousness, they became capable of anything. But memory is selective, and time has a way of softening edges that once drew blood. 50 years after Control Station Enclave sank beneath the Pacific, there were people in the wasteland who questioned whether the threat had been exaggerated, who pointed out that the Enclave had possessed advanced medical technology and organizational skills that were lost when they were destroyed, who wondered if accommodation rather than elimination might have been possible. These revisionists never gained significant following, but their existence demonstrated how quickly even recent horrors could be transformed into debatable history. The sites where Enclave atrocities occurred became contested spaces in both physical and memorial terms. Some communities wanted monuments acknowledging what happened. Others preferred to forget to move forward, without dwelling on suffering they could not change. Archaeologists who excavated test sites faced protests from both sides. Descendants of victims who wanted documentation, and settlers who had built homes on contaminated ground and did not want reminders that their foundations rested on mass graves. The equipment that survived found unexpected purposes far removed from its original intent. Enclave power armor, stripped of insignia, protected caravan guards and settlement defenders. Vertibirds transported medical supplies and connected isolated communities. Energy weapons that had burned villages now held perimeters against Deathclaw migrations and raider incursions. The technology persisted, but its meaning transformed through use. Tools that had been instruments of genocide became infrastructure for the societies that had nearly been erased. Children born in the wasteland 3 generations after the Enclave's fall knew them only as antagonists in stories told by grandparents. The details blurred with repetition. The soldiers in shining armor who came from the ocean. The plague they carried. The hero who stopped them by turning their own weapon against them. These narratives took on mythic qualities, simplified into good versus evil tales that lost the complicated humanity of everyone involved. The Enclave became monsters in the cultural memory. Their victims became saints. And the truth, messy and painful, receded beneath layers of storytelling. Yet the fundamental question they raised never disappeared. What does humanity owe to itself when survival seems to require terrible choices? The Enclave had answered by declaring that some humans mattered more than others based on genetic criteria. The wasteland rejected that answer, but the question remained. Every settlement that turned away refugees, every faction that hoarded resources, every community that defined itself by who it excluded rather than who it embraced. They all faced versions of the dilemma the Enclave had confronted and made different calculations about acceptable costs. The modified FEV slept in secured vaults under Brotherhood guard, samples preserved for study and potential countermeasure development. Scientists who examined it marveled at the elegance of its design even while understanding its horror. It represented the apex of pre-war genetic engineering, weaponized with precision that exceeded anything the old world had achieved. And that knowledge lived now in research databases, in the minds of specialists who understood how it functioned. It could not be uninvented. It could only be prevented from being deployed again by societies that remembered why its use was unconscionable. Some nights, in settlements across the wasteland, elderly survivors who remembered the Enclave told stories to younger generations who had never known that fear. They described the sound of vertibirds approaching, the sight of power-armored soldiers establishing perimeters, the terrible realization that these attackers were not raiders seeking supplies, but executioners fulfilling an ideology. And they explained that surviving such threats required more than weapons or walls. It required communities willing to defend not just themselves but everyone, because genocidal logic never stopped with its first targets. The Chosen One grew old in Arroyo, watching his descendants build futures that the Enclave had tried to prevent. He never spoke much about what happened inside Control Station Enclave during those final hours. Some details were not meant for retelling. Some choices did not become easier to justify just because they worked. He had released a virus that killed 300 people and saved millions. He had walked through corridors of dying enemies and felt no satisfaction, only exhaustion. He had stolen their research and delivered it to the wasteland so history would remember them accurately, rather than as martyrs who almost restored civilization. His legacy was not the heroism that stories usually celebrated. It was the uglier truth that stopping monsters sometimes required becoming one temporarily, using their own weapons against them, descending to their level in the moment even if you climb back out afterward. The wasteland honored him for saving them, but they could not understand the cost of doing what circumstances demanded. The way contamination worked, both physically and morally, the way releasing that virus marked him forever as someone who had crossed lines that should not exist, but sometimes must be crossed anyway. The last confirmed Enclave installation, a monitoring station in the Midwest that had operated independently for decades, shut down in 2297. The personnel simply walked away, abandoning their posts and disappearing into the wasteland as individuals rather than members of an organization that no longer functioned. Some joined communities under assumed names. Others died alone in bunkers they refused to leave, and a handful reportedly traveled west, seeking the ocean where their headquarters had sunk, to bear witness to the place where their ideology drowned. The Enclave left behind questions more than answers, about the nature of authority and legitimacy, about when survival imperatives become justifications for atrocity, about whether technology amplifies human nature or reveals it, about how to build societies that preserve themselves without defining themselves through the elimination of others. These questions had existed before the Enclave gave them institutional form. They would persist long after the last person who wore Enclave armor had died. They were not problems that could be solved, but tensions that required constant navigation by anyone attempting to build something lasting in the ruins. And so the wasteland continued its slow reconstruction, carrying the memory of what nearly happened as a cautionary weight that shaped but did not define its progress. Settlements grew into towns. Towns confederated into territories. Trade networks expanded. Technology spread. And always, beneath the optimism of building, lived the understanding that civilization was fragile, that it could be twisted toward monstrous ends by people who believed themselves righteous, that eternal vigilance was not paranoia, but survival instinct earned through nearly being exterminated by those who claimed to represent the best of what humanity could become. The Enclave had promised to restore America. Instead, they demonstrated why that America had failed in the first place, why its ideology of manifest destiny and hierarchical purity had produced the conditions that made nuclear war inevitable. Why trying to resurrect that vision meant repeating those failures with even deadlier consequences. The wasteland learned from their collapse that the future could not be built by returning to the past. It required accepting what they had become and building from that reality rather than trying to purify it away. In the end, the Enclave's darkest secret was not the modified virus, or the planned extermination, or the experiments conducted in sealed laboratories. It was the realization that they were not exceptional, that every human society carried the potential for what they became, that the difference between civilization and genocide was not fundamental morality, but institutional checks, cultural values, and individual choices repeated across generations. The Enclave had removed those checks, inverted those values, and made the wrong choices until they became a machine built to destroy what they claimed to protect. The wasteland survived them, not because it was stronger or purer or more deserving, but because someone had been willing to stop them when stopping them required becoming weapon rather than witness. Because scattered communities had cooperated despite their differences. Because the diversity the Enclave tried to eliminate proved more resilient than the uniformity they tried to impose. And because sometimes in the most critical moments, individuals make choices that determine whether their entire species deserves another generation. That was the lesson, written in blood across Enclave test sites and burned into the memories of those who had watched their organization dissolve from within. That purity was a fantasy, and contamination was reality. That trying to enforce genetic destiny led only to mass graves and burning platforms. That the future belonged not to those who claimed superiority, but to those who accepted complexity and built anyway. And that the greatest threats to humanity never came from obvious monsters, but from organized people who believed their terrible actions served righteous purposes. The files remain sealed in Brotherhood archives, accessible only to scholars and strategists who needed to understand how close extinction had come. The modified virus slept in containment that would last centuries if maintained properly. The memories faded as those who had lived through it died and their children inherited only stories. But the fundamental warning persisted, encoded into wasteland culture, at depths that shaped decisions without requiring conscious thought. Never trust those who promise purity. Never follow leaders who categorize people into worthy and disposable. Never accept that survival requires genocide, and never forget that technology without wisdom, authority without accountability, and ideology without compassion will always lead to Control Station Enclave sinking beneath the waves, taking with it everyone who believed themselves superior to the contaminated world they tried to exterminate. The wasteland remembers. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to recognize the warning signs. Enough to resist when new voices promise restoration through elimination. Enough to choose messy coexistence over sterile extinction. The Enclave tried to write the future in genetic code and operational protocols. Instead, they became a chapter in history, studied for what they revealed about human capacity for organized evil, justified as patriotic duty. Their legacy was not the America they tried to reclaim, but the reminder that some pasts should stay buried rather than resurrected. And in that reminder lived whatever hope the wasteland possessed for actually building something better, not by returning to what was lost, but by accepting what remained and choosing daily, imperfectly, to value life over purity, complexity over simplicity, and the difficult work of coexistence over the seductive clarity of elimination. The Enclave had chosen differently. The wasteland survived because enough people refused to follow that choice, even when following would have been easier than resistance. The story ends, but the files remain open, waiting for anyone determined enough to read them. Waiting to remind future generations what their ancestors narrowly escaped. Waiting to whisper the truth that the Enclave tried to bury beneath layers of propaganda and genetic theory. That humanity's greatest threat has always been humanity itself, organized and certain, and convinced that mass murder serves higher purpose. And that surviving such threats requires eternal vigilance from those who understand that civilization is not what you preserve but what you build, every day through choices that honor life over ideology. You have been immersed in Lower Forge, where every conspiracy carries a pulse, and every buried truth eventually surfaces. Until our paths cross again, wanderer, question everything. Especially those who claim to act in your best interest, especially those who promise salvation through elimination, and especially the voice inside that whispers, some people matter more than others. That voice nearly ended the world once. It waits still in the darkness between certainties, hoping for another chance. Do not give it one.